undisputed king of stars.
Inez Feltscher Stepman, wife of Jarrett Stepman, as she mentions on her Twitter bio. She's a senior policy analyst at IWF, that's the Independent Women's Forum. She also hosts a great podcast on Ricochet, I might add, High Noon with Inez Stepman. First off, welcome. Great to chat with you.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, something that I noticed about you, and I know that you are a Lincoln Fellow with the Claremont Institute, and I'm not sure what year that began. With me, it began last year. And kind of leading up to it, I was, I don't know. I used to be stuck in the, hey, I'm a conservative running in 1994 mindset of, well, all we need is freer trade and lower taxes and everything's great. And as the world got crazier and crazier around me, I thought, wow, this leaves out a lot of stuff when you look at all of politics as just a matter of economics, just looking as people as little fungible units, just like you do green rectangles and dollar bills. And kind of started expanding it and seeing, okay, I think a lot of traditional conservatism, which I guess you would just call Reaganism, has just left out a whole bunch of other stuff that people are struggling with these days. So was that a change that happened for you as well over years, or did you always kind of think that way and think about things like national conservatism and what they talk about at those conferences?
Sure, and I think that's a sort of change in thinking that a lot of us have gone through. I certainly didn't start out in this part of the right as way more libertarian in college, for sure. I don't know how much of that was our politics and how much of that is just being in college. Libertarianism tends to be a gateway drug to the right for a lot of people.
Right.
So I don't know how much of it, but certainly in the last 5 years or so, and I actually really noticed it. I had Tim Carney on my podcast about a year ago, and in order to do that, I went back and read his very enlightening work about the election of 2016. And at the time, in like 2015-ish, right, he was putting out a lot of this work basically saying Trump voters are disconnected from a lot of sort of the institutions. They're not regular churchgoers. They tend to come from broken families. And then also they have this view of the system as rigged, right? Which is something that back then we used to associate with Bernie Sanders and the left. And it really struck me going back and reading in 2022 or maybe the end of 2021. I can't remember exactly when I had him on and I was rereading this book. It struck me that a lot of the critiques that I heard leveled that he sort of as an anthropologist collected from Trump voters now to me read as very obviously true about our institutions, about the system, about the institutional rot and the fundamental inability to, both to be competent and to advance anything close to the truth. And here I'm not talking just about government, right? I think that would have been easier for sort of Reaganite brain me to accept, but also about the private sector. And it seems to me that over the last 5 years, those things have come true in spades. We now look at, for example, agencies that the right once, respected, law enforcement agencies like the DOJ and the FBI, and we see how they behaved for 4 years under Trump. We think about like the media, which was always biased, but the media's role in perpetuating actual extremely harmful lies like the Russia hoax, right? That very well may have guided U.S. foreign policy during the Trump administration. I mean, and I'm no great fan of sort of the seemingly perennial idea with every American administration of reset with Russia. But there was a very real constraint on what the president and and his foreign policy advisors could do because of the domestic perception created by something that was completely a lie, right? That there were that the Trump campaign had deep ties with Putin and that Trump was basically a Manchurian candidate, right? And that really constrained the ability of foreign policy elected of an elected president, right? So, I mean, a lot of the things where I look back at it, and then also looking into the economic side of things, the way that corporations have both advanced leftist cultural values in the last 5 years very, very clearly, and the proliferation within private companies of, let's just say, jobs that don't add a dime to the wealth of nations, right? That seem purely sort of ideologically policing jobs, or in the slightly better case, just, email jobs, right? That very little actual concrete product is coming out of it. All of this added up to me to a deeper critique of our system, and led me to think about some of the questions that Irving Kristol raised, I think, very presciently in 1973, in a talk he gave to I can't remember what the name of the society was, but it was at that time run by Milton Friedman, and before that had been run by Hayek. So that kind of the economic libertarian right. So he was going into a hostile sort of audience when he gave this talk. But the essence of the talk was, we have to think about whether a free market, liberty-based society can actually perpetuate the type of person who is capable of sustaining enough of a civilization in order to perpetuate the free market, right? In other words, he points to the limitations of free market ideology, of actually solving some of these more classical, in some ways more ancient problems of the polity, right? And problems of politics, capital P. And I think that was very prescient, and that's kind of how my thinking has evolved as well. The short version would be, on the little what is it, the political squares, like the authoritarian left, the authoritarian right, all of this stuff. There's this very funny meme where it's the "Don't step on me" snake coiled in the libertarian corner, and then the boot from the authoritarian left coming down to step on the snake, and then the snake rising up into the authoritarian right.
Yeah,
like, this kind
that's
of
perfect.
That has very much been my intellectual transition over the last 5 years.
Yeah, completely with me too. And I think also is, if you look at politics from kind of an intellectual lens, I think that's the appeal of libertarianism. You can make everything fit in its nice little box, and nope, this is the right answer, this is the wrong answer. It's kind of, I was one of the idiot nerds who liked math class, so it's all very mathematical, but yeah, you start to realize over time, especially with the far left going, completely losing their mind, starting all this culture war stuff, is you start realizing, oh, I've been measuring everything as economic units because you can actually measure those, and it's easy to do that. But there's much more to life than just the economy. And yeah, free market, globalist free market would probably be good for the bottom line, but that's not what people mostly care about. They care about their families, they care about their neighborhoods. They wonder why the factory down the street is shutting down, and the jobs are being outsourced to, I don't know, Burma this week, or whatever country is getting all the capital inflows. And you just start realizing there's a lot more to life than just gross domestic product, I guess. And that changes your mind a lot, especially when you see the effects on people, as you mentioned, with foreign policy as well, especially since 2000, just seeing our brilliant, well-meaning, highly informed, compassionate elites getting every single issue wrong for 20 plus years. You start going, maybe they don't really know what they're doing, and maybe they aren't as nice as they're pretending to be, because it's just, the stock market drop in 2008, the Iraq war, we had that, the constant dithering on immigration, and just letting that, run rampant. I live in Arizona, so just seeing, oh, there's a family running through my backyard right now. So, yeah, so it's just a constant problem that our so-called elites, who are saying, trust us, are the ones in charge of COVID and completely messing that up as well. And it's like, I don't think our elites are all that elite.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not against the concept of an elite in leadership, but it seems like our elite not only has gotten so many things wrong in retrospect, but has a certain arrogance that is totally unjustified by the midwittery that seems to have been elevated. I think part of this is we have, as James Burnham also presciently wrote about, but we have transitioned away from a kind of rough and tumble capitalist economy into something that is more managerial, more bureaucratic,
Mm-hmm.
and the thing about the qualities of people who rise in a bureaucracy are very, very different than the qualities of people that, say, like 19th century American capitalism were bringing to the
Right.
fore, right? Think about somebody like Andrew Jackson, who held basically 12 different careers that we would think about, right?
Yeah.
He was a soldier, a general, a judge, a lawyer, a politician, a businessman, like a planter, right? I mean, this is
Mm-hmm.
like 10 lives by modern standards. We
And now we
have,
have Pete Buttigieg.
right, exact. Actually,
Yeah.
that's a really good example. He is the pinnacle of sort of what qualities are required for success in our kind of
Mm-hmm.
heavily managed technocratic economy and society. So, like, I haven't changed my mind on the free market insofar as I think the free market is the best economic system for delivering
Mm-hmm.
wealth and what people want. But it can't tell us what is good for people to
Mm-hmm.
want, which impulses of the human condition should be encouraged or discouraged, right? So in that sense, it sort of depoliticizes politics.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it a matter of in this way, it is sort of I think joined at the hip to some degree, at least psychologically, with a kind of turn of the century progressivism, where it fundamentally thinks that there is a science of management and government that can
Mm-hmm.
sidestep the normative questions of politics, where ultimately, in any political unit, whether it's democratic or not, right, there's a good being advanced, a good being defended, a bad being punished, right? There are normative questions of politics that are totally sidestepped by a combination of sort of neoliberal technocracy on the one hand, and this sort of science of government and treating people like widgets, and that you're referring
Mm-hmm.
to. And then on the other hand, these questions are sort of sidestepped, although I don't think inevitably so, but I think by a devolution of small L liberalism, that ignores a lot of the other impulses within the American founding and the American way of life, and clings only to a sort of post 1960s even vision of small L liberalism, that I think is not, can't be held. Like, the center can't be held.
Yeah.
And that's where I find myself parting with a lot of even allies on some of these cultural issues,
Mm-hmm.
who come from the center left or come from the IDW, because I very much look backwards at the 90s and early 2000s and say, wow, there were people in the 90s. We laughed at them. We called them, rubes and knuckle draggers, but the, Christian conservative, the moral majority, that called every single one of the degeneracies that is happening today. If
Right.
anything,
Right.
they were wrong the other way. They just thought it would take longer for us to completely devolve into, defending grooming of minors. Okay. So they thought it
Yeah.
might take a little longer to do that, but they were right on all substantive matters.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the question arises, how were they able to see that in 1995? Well, maybe it is because this kind of post 1960s liberalism, really, there is no principled way to draw a distinction between the 90s liberalism and sort of social libertinism,
Mm-hmm.
and the one today. That, in fact, if you grant this premise of the radically self-defining, like, spark of the self that must
Mm-hmm.
be above all things protected from any kind of restriction or undue influence, whether from government or from society, culture, right, to be able to discover your true self, that inevitably devolves into 56 genders and people, and I think, by the way, also devolves into a lot of unhappiness, because it turns out that
Mm-hmm.
eking yourself out of whole cloth with no guideposts at all from family, from religion, from nation is not actually natural to the human person, and leads to a lot of navel gazing and consequent unhappiness.
Yeah, and just the atomization we see across our culture when everybody is self-defined, bring in religion. If everybody is their own pope, nobody can agree on anything. They're going to disagree about every issue there is. And I think the limits too of kind of a hardcore libertarianism. One reason I never like joined the LP or anything like that. I remember sitting next to an objectivist in college. I've only met objectivists in a college setting, of course. Trying to win me over. Oh, you share a lot of our ideas. Let's get into this. And I didn't know much about Ayn Rand or any of that stuff at that age, but I could just see the inherent flaw was just this pure materialist perspective on things. And the more I thought about it, kind of a more pure, I have very libertarian tendencies. Part of it, growing up out west, it's you kind of have the leave us the hell alone kind of conservatives. And so I have that libertarian instinct. But when you get into that as your entire life affirming philosophy, it's materialist, just like communism. It's like the only thing that matters is the material world. Culture doesn't matter unless you can just stomp on it with a boot again and have political commissars in every corporation. I'm sorry, HR reps. But every organization has their own political commissar attached. You're allowed to say this, you're not allowed to say that. But when you reduce everybody to an economic unit, a unit of production, a lot is lost. And I'll follow all these accounts on Twitter about old architecture and why can't we build like this anymore. But a lot of it too is just things that are more important than politics are things like beauty and truth and the soul. And yeah, politics isn't going to fix all of it, but you don't want politicians who are trying to stomp on that 24/7, which it seems like our political ruling class loves to do.
Yeah, I mean, look, I take your point about that. There is a Jeffersonian sort of impulse, and especially in the
Mm-hmm.
West, there's sort of a difference between the big L libertarian and the small L libertarian impulses. A lot of people, and I've actually gotten into some discussions with people again, sort of the new right, the people, and I actually haven't done this with Orrin himself, but folks who tend more towards the Orrin Cass position on various policy issues, which I actually, in many cases, end up agreeing with Orrin on some of this stuff. And I think certainly we should be open to it, to thinking through
Mm-hmm.
some of these policy consequences. But I do see one of the central tensions of the Republican Party nowadays is uniting, I think, different, both essential impulses and economic interests of the Sun Belt versus the Rust Belt, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where actually small L libertarian impulses are very much a part of the conservatism of Sun Belt, of Arizona, Nevada,
Mm-hmm.
right? Even if you go like
Whole
Idaho,
lot of
Mountain
Mountain
West,
West,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, there is that there is that sort of Jeffersonian impulse. And I don't think that's entirely wrong. I mean, I think that impulse in some ways did save at least parts of America during COVID from a more uniform lockdown, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think post-COVID, we should probably not be in a hurry to completely squash out that impulse as sort of foreign or illegitimate in our politics or even the politics of the right. So I do think it produces some good things. I don't know that it is a higher guide, the way that some seem to suggest that it is. But the ultimate question in some of this, I see you kind of hinting at to me, is the question of whether the nation is anything more than an economic zone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even the economic zone part is kind of difficult because what we've discovered is that our elites and the elites of other countries actually might have more both interest and cultural commonalities with each other than they do with
Right.
us. And that's why I think you see a lot of the similar dynamics playing out in a different political context with a lot of different,
Mm-hmm.
countries, but fundamentally this kind of tension between an elite that really does not see itself as particularly tied to nation, a truly
Mm-hmm.
globalist elite, um, and with a certain set of mostly of economic interests that desire further to blur the national boundaries both economically and culturally, to import cheap labor into the country and to export to offshore, I should say is the right word for it, offshore costs of manufacturing, right? And what I think we're seeing around the world is people at least confronting in totally different contexts for each country, confronting, you know, and asserting the primacy of the nation state back into
Mm-hmm.
this discussion, that we actually haven't come to the end of history. We haven't all agreed on this kind of palliative liberalism around the world, and reasserting the fact that, one, that the nation state exists and is the primary unit of geopolitics, and second, that, if you're in the American context, right, that the people are reasserting some ability to control the destiny of the country, both economically and culturally, right? Whereas a lot of these questions were basically pushed out of the political sphere altogether. If you think about major cultural turning points in the last 30 years in America, it's mostly been in the courts and the administrative state, right? Gay marriage,
Congress
abortion,
isn't doing anything at all. Yeah.
Right. There was very little that people were actually voting on. And I think I hope we're seeing a sort of, well, I'll get to the pessimistic part in a minute, but I think we will see an attempt to reassert a kind of small d democratic power, or at least a sort of self-determinative power within nations, and particularly within this nation.
Yeah, I agree completely. And yeah, I think something that really helped reveal it to a lot of people who don't pay a lot of attention to politics because they're too busy living their lives was COVID. And when you see people, Davos agrees with Singapore, agrees with, I don't know, London and Washington, D.C. and Buenos Aires and Beijing, all of them are totally fine with the exact same restrictions on people, and people in each individual country is like, oh, that doesn't work for us, so you have that, Sweden saying, no, we're not going to do this crazy lockdown. More recently, you see like the Dutch farmers gaining just a shocking number of seats in the Netherlands, because people are trying to force EU green initiatives on them and basically say, to save the planet, we need to shut down all the farms, which is illogical on its face. And you also will see the uprisings like in Sri Lanka, that was trying to play fair by the global elite's rules that they set, and it's completely destroyed the country's economy. People are just saying enough is enough. And it's amazing to me that, well, first off, it's good that I think all the COVID insanity kind of peeled the mask off a lot of these things. And people, regardless of their political ideology, are looking through and saying, oh, wait, things have gotten really crazy, and it's not just COVID, it's all sorts of things. And that's why you can have Russell Brand hanging out with Joe Rogan, hanging out with Douglas Murray. Those three people would not agree on anything 5 years ago. And now they're all like, oh yeah, we're all saying the same thing. This is nuts. But I think that part is encouraging.
Yeah, I really think our politics is reshuffling. Whether that reshuffling will ultimately impact, what happens with the establishments of the two parties, I don't know. In some ways, we have an advantage. I was just at NatCon UK, and my husband and I were discussing something that seems for our situation here at home, to be a bit more optimistic, in comparison to the one in the UK, because there the parties control, it's all inter-party, right? Like, so
right.
there's no like real rebellion within the party of replacing the establishment, or it's very, very difficult to do. Our system, obviously, to some extent, does allow for that kind of thing. That's why, the Republican Party ended up with Donald Trump as a nominee in 2016, right? To some extent, especially the Republican Party does allow some of that more than the Democrats. The Democrats, contrary to their name, have super delegates, much more stricter control over who is sort of allowed to run. That's why Obama could immediately lean on everyone to get out when it looked like Bernie was going to take the nomination there. There's no such figure in the Republican Party that has that kind of power to push people out of the race like that. But I mean, I'm somewhat pessimistic, because like it seems like there's these real conversations happening, and I don't mean just on the intellectual, whatever, chattering class, right? But it seems to me that people, voters, are interested in questions of, big tech power, for example. They're interested in questions about like that seem totally out of our politics, or not enough in our politics, like the opioid crisis and lowering the life expectancy in a first world rich country, right? it seems like there are a lot of these issues that people are talking about and recognize as serious, challenging issues in the same way that they continue to recognize some of the issues from 2016, which were, I think, the issues that were sort of subterranean and being ignored by the establishment of both parties, were immigration and trade. Those two things continue to be
Mhm.
part of that sort of bundle of issues. But I mean, then you look at the debates that we're having over, even the debt ceiling, and they seem very, very detached from one another, right? In other words, the
Yeah.
real issues of political concern to voters, or I don't know, uh, I would add on this just the fact that everything seems not to work. I mean, you were kind of alluding to it, like
Right.
our
Right.
supply chains still aren't back to normal. Like prices of
Mhm.
things are not only inflation, which we do talk about, but also like random fluctuations, random shortages. Like there just seems things seem not to work in the
Mhm.
same way that they did in 2019. Um, all of these issues seem not to be addressed at all by either political party, really.
Mhm. Yeah, and they're avoiding these issues to it seemed like dispatches from 20 years ago reading about the debt limit story out of Washington because oh my gosh, we're going to default, it's the end of the world, and everybody's, I don't know. Most people these days are looking at it and going, "Oh, it's all fake anyway." We're 31.8 trillion in debt or whatever it is this week. This is just nonsense, you guys pretending. And then out of the blue, Janet Yellen said, "Oh, we actually have an extra week," because the same weekend Joe Biden is going on vacation. All of a sudden, oh look, we have a little bit of extra time. It's like, yeah, because it's all made up. I know there's more that goes into it than that, but average Joe out there, something that I've noticed too in the past few years among apolitical friends, guys who used to save up and spend money on, oh, I'm going to get a new pair of jet skis or something. Now they're digging wells on their property. It's people are like, okay, I got to hunker down and I got to be ready. And these are not, survivalist, nutty people. They live in, I would say, the exurbs of Phoenix kind of a thing. But people are like, oh, nobody is coming to save us. I just need to be prepared and know what's what. And the good way to deal with this is, okay, I'm going to get closer to my family. I'm getting more integrated with my neighbors, with community efforts. But then you have the dark side, which a lot of us are concerned about, is the atomization. People just sitting on their phones all day scrolling. I couldn't tell you how thrilled I was when my eldest daughter said, "I feel bad when I use Instagram." So she just deleted Twitter. And I'm like, good. Okay, good. Good deal. I'm glad you noticed that it just is this envy machine that makes you feel bad about yourself. But what do you think for the future? Because the choices between the two visions seem very stark.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not clear that it is on the actual voting level, that
Mm-hmm.
because it doesn't seem like those stark differences are actually reflected in the parties.
Yeah.
People are always whining about polarization. To my mind, there is not enough
Mm-hmm.
polarization. Um, the polarization is a reflection of deeply different visions, and I think this really, to your point about the digging wells and like preparing for in some fundamental way for the country to go off the rails, like
Mm-hmm.
um how badly I don't know, but there does seem like, um to me it felt like we lived through regime change uh
Mm-hmm.
in 2020, right? Even aesthetically, we saw one set of statues come down, new set go up. We saw very clearly the total uh two-tiered justice system, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
you had an entire summer of people burning and looting in cities. I mean, I was in Washington D.C. I remember I saw it with my own two eyes. You cannot tell me it didn't
Mm-hmm.
happen. I was standing on the roof of the apartment building that I lived in Northwest Washington D.C., looking around the city, and there were something like 8 or 9 different fires burning, and like massive fires burning in the city.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There were absolutely no consequences and no law and order applied. Most mayors told and most states told their police forces to stand down and their National
Right.
Guard to stand down, right? And basically allowed this to happen. And then on the flip side, we see the like every jot and tittle and sometimes beyond that of the book, thrown at every person who mildly wandered into the Capitol. I'm not even saying committed other crimes, right?
Yeah.
Of which there were some who committed serious crimes and were prosecuted.
Mm-hmm.
But even somebody who sort of blindly wandered through the Capitol after like the barriers had come down, we're seeing them prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. In many cases, more than a year in pretrial detention, which is not supposed to happen. It was justified by COVID or whatever, but very, very clearly. And then we couple that with the memos from the FBI about concerned parents being potential domestic terrorists. The way that the FBI is categorizing both white supremacy and domestic terrorism, and also opening all of these cases, quote unquote, in all of these. Andy McCarthy has a really great explainer about this, by the way, but that they're generating the statistics that they need to do the current, to continue the crackdown against, quote unquote, white supremacy and domestic terrorism being the number one threat, domestic threat to the United States. And they're doing that by essentially treating what was once considered basically one case, one batch of cases. They're opening each of these individual cases and they're counting them in the statistics, basically for anyone who was related to anything in January 6th, right? And that's how they're creating this impression that they then testify to Congress and say, well, our domestic terrorism cases are up by 300% from last year. Well, yeah, because you're opening all of these cases and that you never would have opened 3 years ago and counting them as multiple cases. In any case, that is a bit in the weeds, I think, or rambling a bit, but I think that feeling of the two-tiered justice system, all of that really makes you feel like a dissident and not like a domestic opponent, right? Like it makes being on the right feel in a very like tactile way, like there are no real solutions through ordinary means of politics. That's a very dangerous place for the country to be. I sometimes am amazed by how blasé the left is about stepping on the right's neck in this country, and I don't know that they think. I don't know if they've never met any guy with a bunch of guns in Arizona, but how long they think they can, step on this guy's neck before he responds in kind, right? I kind of agree, at least mentally, with the feeling of that we fundamentally live in a different country than we did even 5 or 10 years ago.
Right. And even JFK had some quote, and I'll just summarize it here. But he said, any society that doesn't allow peaceful change to happen is inviting violent revolution. And, this is JFK saying that. It's like you need to be able to let people have a voice. And it seems like the goal of this entire elite class, multinational elite class, is just to get rid of everybody's voices because they know it's best and they're smart. And then when it's time to prove their intelligence, they fall flat on their face. And it's just like, okay, you people can't think your way out of a wet paper bag. Why am I substituting my own common sense for your silly little agenda and your moral panics that change year to year? This year it's trans, before that Black Lives Matter, before that COVID, before that Me Too, before that climate change. There's always, it's like I used to do marketing, so it's like every summer has a new marketing pitch, and in this case it's why America's horrible, and everybody, all hands on deck, we all have to run around screaming about this issue. And so now you say, well, it's very important to let 50-year-old men hang out in a bathroom with little girls. And it's like, well, wait a minute, wasn't Me Too just 3 years ago? No, that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter anymore. Now we're on this new thing where the only thing that matters is making sure a 50-year-old dude can share a bathroom with a little girl. And I hope a lot more people are waking up and saying, okay, this is crazy.
Yeah, but that's kind of what frustrates me sometimes in this discourse, is like nobody even has or I shouldn't say nobody, very few people seem to even remember what happened 3 years ago, right? You just gave a litany of all the current things, right? Sometimes contradictory. And there's a lot of, this is to return maybe to some of the subject from the beginning of like where the right should be and the need to take a sort of normative stance that doesn't slip over time. I mean, that's the frustrating thing about being on the right, right? There is this real and actually provable sense that, at least culturally, we're slipping left and left and left all the time. And that yes, there was a backlash, just like, for example, with gay marriage, there was a backlash against gay marriage when it was, first floated as an idea. Easy to forget, right? That even in California, gay marriage went down in flames, right? Even among Obama voters, there was a cultural backlash to that idea that has completely melted. And so when I see people, for example, feeling very optimistic and using phrases like quote unquote peak woke, like there's a real backlash to this stuff, I agree that there's a backlash. The question is whether that backlash, that each step of this game has had a backlash. The question is whether that backlash can be sustained enough to confront sort of its institutionalization and bureaucratization, if that's a word, of this ideology, to actually assert itself, to pass normative, positive policy that prevents this from happening in the future, right? Whether there's actually a serious and sustained response that takes into account looking backwards for the last 30 years and how each of those backlashes has failed. And that I don't really see, at least from the Republican Party. I don't see that. I don't see that like sustained, strategic, thoughtful way of, okay, so how do we, the right, actually institutionalize our ideas so that we don't get steamrollered over time by these leftist ideas within these institutions, because we have come to a crisis point by doing that. And so now the question is not just, do 80% of people in a poll or 75% of people say that it's ridiculous for a 50-year-old man who claims that he's a woman to shower with 11-year-old girls? Okay, I believe you can get very strong polling on that issue, right? The question is, are we willing to pass laws, both in the state and federal level? Are we willing to actually convert this into concrete policy? Are we willing to set up institutionally the ability to fight this idea in the future? Because if not, then 10 years from now, or even 5 years from now, things go faster now. We'll get a Republican politician who says, well, of course we respect trans rights, but this next, but furry rights are, a step too far.
Yeah. And backlash is, by definition, a defensive measure. We're going to have to take to the offense pretty soon. Inez Feltscher Stepman, thanks so much for being on. Where can people find your work? I'll be including links in the show notes.
You can find my work and my colleagues' work at Independent Women's Forum, IWF.org. You can also find me on Twitter. It's at Inez Feltscher, INEZFELTSCHER. You can also just search Inez Stepman. It comes up.
Yeah, she's great. Everybody follow her and everything she does. Thanks so much for being on. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.